What if Britain's most powerful tank was designed by a company that made cigarette vending machines? A machine meant to blow Soviet IS-3s apart with a single shot, but whose own smart targeting system broke down more often than it fired. Its crews hated serving inside this steel hell, and mechanics prayed it would just start. This is the story of the FV-214 Conqueror, a 64-ton monster born from panic after a single parade, a tank meant to be a nightmare for the USSR, but instead became a nightmare for its own troops. In this investigation, you will learn how the sight of a Soviet IS-3 in Berlin sent shockwaves and paralysis through the British General Staff, why the tank's heart was an old aircraft engine destined to constantly stall, why tankers nicknamed the commander's cupola a solitary confinement cell, and why loaders wanted to throw the genius spent casing ejector out the window. And the main point, why this titan, into which millions were poured, served only 11 years without ever firing at an enemy, and how its shameful failure led to the legendary chieftain. This isn't a tale of glorious machinery. It's a story of how fear, panic, and rushed engineering give birth to a weapon that breaks itself. Ready to see what the most problematic and useless titan of the Cold War looked like? Then watch till the end. September 1945. The air over ruined Berlin was thick with dust and hidden tension. The war in Europe was formally over, but a new act of geopolitical theater was unfolding on the streets of the defeated Nazi capital, the Allied Victory Parade. Among the high command in the stands were British officers. They watched their own columns of polished hardware with professional interest and rightful pride. It seemed a display of shared victory, but that day, victory suddenly had two different faces. Their calm was shattered by the roar of diesel engines and the clatter of tracks of a new, unseen force. 52 Soviet heavy tanks rolled onto the cobblestones, their appearance making even battle-hardened veterans freeze. These were IS-3s. They were unlike anything the Allies had faced before. Their silhouette was the embodiment of a new, frightening armor philosophy. Instead of familiar angular shapes, they had sleek, almost organic lines. A massive, flattened, hemispherical turret, devoid of tempting edges for shells, and the main feature, the infamous pike nose, a frontal hull of two heavily sloped armor plates meeting at a sharp angle. This wasn't just design, it was calculation. Such armor didn't just take a hit, it forced it to slide off, ricochet, lose energy. For British tankers and designers who had studied tigers and panthers in battle, this was a shock. The enemy hadn't stood still, they had leapt forward, years ahead of its time. Alarming calculations flew through headquarters instantly. The pride of the British post-war army, the recently adopted Centurion Mark I medium tank, looked helpless in a hypothetical clash with this monster. Its 76mm gun, quite effective against the Panther, was unlikely to seriously threaten the frontal armor of an IS-3 at real combat ranges. Meanwhile, the 122mm shell of the Soviet Heavy could easily penetrate the Centurion's 76mm of armor from over a kilometer away. This wasn't a duel, it was a foregone massacre. Intelligence reports only worsened the panic. The USSR was preparing the IS-3 for mass production. In the minds of London strategists, a nightmare scenario arose. Thousands of these steel giants, built deep in the rear, suddenly crashing into Central Europe. No Centurions could be a serious barrier. They needed not to catch up, but to jump a whole generation ahead. Thus, an absolutely clear, desperate task was born. They needed to create not just a new tank, but a specialized Titan killer, a machine whose power was concentrated in one thing: the ability to detect and guarantee the destruction of a Soviet heavy tank from a distance it wouldn't even know where the blow came from. The focus shifted from versatility and mobility to pure, overwhelming firepower and range. This future project, given the dry ID index FV214 and the formidable name Conqueror, carried from its conception the spirit of cold, distant retaliation. It was to be not a sword for attack, but a precise and heavy cudgel in the armored fist of defense. And to forge it, British engineers had to turn to projects history itself seemed to have already archived.
Work on the answer to the Soviet challenge didn't start from scratch. Searching for a quick solution, British engineers turned to military archives. Their attention was drawn to the A-45 project, an ambitious, heavy infantry support tank developed late in the war but never leaving the prototype stage. Its massive, robust chassis seemed the perfect foundation for a new machine. It had the necessary strength to bear the weight of a monstrously heavy turret and a new gun. Thus, the future Conqueror was doomed from the start to inherit traits of a bygone era: the concept of a slow but super-protected infantry tank. The initial plan seemed logical: mount a new, powerful turret with 120mm gun on this chassis. However, the first calculations and a growing stream of intelligence cast doubt on the sufficiency of such a caliber. They had to counter not only the IS-3, but its potential successors. They needed absolute superiority. Therefore, in 1949, the project was radically revised. They decided to abandon the initially considered 20-pounder or 84mm gun in favor of a true giant, the 120mm rifled L1 gun. This step was unprecedented for British tank building. The gun was created with one single purpose: its armor-piercing shell had to smash through the thickest Soviet armor at distances exceeding 2 kilometers. But creating such a gun and a turret for it proved harder than expected. Time was passing, and the Army desperately needed something for training and trials. Thus, a compromise and largely odd hybrid was born: the FV221 Carnarvon tank. Essentially, it was the chassis of the future Conqueror, but topped with the already proven turret from the Centurion Mark II with its 20-pounder. 21 of these machines were never meant for war. The Carnarvon became a mobile test bench. On it, they practiced the running gear and transmission, studied the behavior of the heavy chassis on rough terrain, and trained the first driver mechanics. This unsuccessful ancestor became an invaluable training desk, allowing them to identify many problems before the chassis received its true heavyweight head. And when the long-awaited turret with 120mm gun was finally ready by 1954, the engineers already had an idea of the difficult character they would be dealing with.
When the first production models of the FV214 Conqueror left the assembly shop in 1955, they revealed a form more befitting dreadnoughts of a past era than the tanks of the nuclear age. Its mass of 64 tons made the earth tremble, and its dimensions overwhelmed everything around it. The machine's appearance was eloquent and unambiguous. This was not a hunter, but a fortress on tracks. The low, elongated hull, crowned by a huge cast rock-like turret, unmistakably pointed to its lineage. 8 pairs of small road wheels on each side, a sprocket at the rear, and broad track links all were direct references to the pre-war concept of British infantry tanks like the Churchill. The Conqueror didn't strive for elegance or speed. Its purpose was to take a position and hold it, absorbing a blow and delivering a crushing counterstrike. One of the few truly ingenious solutions in its design was the running gear, built on the Horstmann suspension system. Instead of individual suspension for each wheel or complex torsion bars, assembly units, bogies, were used, each holding 2 road wheels and 1 return roller. These units were attached to the hull via powerful horizontal springs. The advantage wasn't in a smooth ride, but in incredible repairability. In the field, after a mine blast or shell damage, the crew could replace an entire damaged bogie with a spare in minutes by unscrewing a few bolts. This turned the tank from a static target into a machine that could be quickly returned to action even under fire. The wide tracks, almost a meter across, helped distribute the monstrous ground pressure, giving the Conqueror surprising mobility for its weight on soft ground and snow. But if the suspension was a practical solution, the power plant became the project's Achilles heel. In the monster's hull beat an aviation heart, the 12-cylinder V-shaped gasoline Rolls-Royce Meteor M120. This engine was a close relative of the legendary Merlin that powered Spitfire fighters and Lancaster bombers. In its tank version, it was seriously detuned, stripped of superchargers, and adapted for dust and mud, but retained its characteristic roar and insatiable appetite. Its 810 horsepower sounded impressive, but for 64 tons of steel, it was frankly inadequate. The power-to-weight ratio was a mere 12.5 HP per ton, making the Conqueror one of the slowest modern tanks in the world. It could reach a maximum of 21 miles per hour, 34 kilometers per hour, on roads, but such pace quickly overheated the already strained engine. The machine was sluggish, cumbersome, and critically had a very short operational range, burning vast amounts of expensive gasoline. The culmination of engineering oddities was the transmission. The tanks were fitted with a 5-speed manual gearbox, but it existed in 2 versions, the Z52 and its modification, the Z52R. They were mechanically similar, but had one fatal difference. Their gear shift patterns were mirror opposites. The lever set to first gear on the Z52 box would engage reverse on the Z52R. This created a situation of constant risk for driver mechanics who might switch from one vehicle to another. Imagine a driver used to one pattern who, in a stressful combat or training situation, tries to move out quickly in an unfamiliar tank. Instead of lurching forward, the 64-ton giant could unexpectedly reverse, threatening to crush its own infantry, vehicles, or roll into a ditch. This absurd roulette was not a minor flaw, but a glaring oversight that complicated training and risked accidents. And while crews struggled with the whims of the chassis and engine, the Conqueror's main strength, its gun and its unprecedented aiming system, were preparing to completely rewrite the rules of tank combat.
The bulky construction of the Conqueror served one purpose: to deliver its main weapon to the battlefield. This was the 120mm rifled L1 gun, one of the most powerful tank guns of its time. It used 2 types of shells, each a nightmare for enemy armor. The first was the armor-piercing discarding sabot round, a tungsten core flying at over 1,400 meters per second could penetrate the armor of a Soviet heavy tank at ranges up to 2 kilometers. The second was the high-explosive squash head shell. Its trick was that upon hitting the armor, the plastic explosive would smear over the surface and then detonate, sending a devastating spall plug from the inside of the armor plate, wiping out everything within the fighting compartment.
This weapon forgave no mistakes. But the real breakthrough wasn't the gun itself, but the fire control system, implemented for the first time on a production vehicle. British engineers introduced a revolutionary concept, later dubbed hunter-killer. Its essence was the radical separation of functions between the commander and the gunner. The commander received not just a hatch, but an entire rotating cupola that could turn 360 degrees independently of the main turret. Inside was his personal periscopic sight, an optical rangefinder, and controls. Now, the commander wasn't a hostage to the gunner's view. He could conduct a constant all-round search for a target, independently measure its range, and, while keeping it in his sight, swing the entire main turret toward it. While the gunner made the precise aim and shot at the first target, the commander was already searching and preparing data for the next. This gave the Conqueror a phenomenal tactical advantage in rate of fire against multiple targets. However, every revolution has a downside. The commander's cupola, this technological masterpiece, became a cage. The commander was physically isolated from the rest of the crew, walled up in his small armored capsule on top. All communication happened only through the intercom, whose failure turned the commander into a lonely, deaf observer. Even more critical was the unreliability of the electric drive for rotating the cupola. It broke down with frightening regularity, and the designers provided no manual backup mechanism. If it failed, the commander lost his main advantage, independent observation, and was forced to look in only one direction until a repair team fixed the malfunction. Thus, the system created for total superiority carried within it the seeds of vulnerability. And while the commander battled loneliness and finicky tech, the other crew members below were about to face far more down-to-earth, but no less grueling trials.
If the commander suffered from isolation in his high perch, the rest of the Conqueror's crew learned hell in the cramped steel hull. The heaviest burden fell to the loader. The L1 gun used separate loading ammunition. First, a projectile weighing up to 16 kilograms was sent into the breach, followed by a heavy brass casing with the propellant charge weighing up to 23 kilograms. Thus, for each shot, the loader had to lift and precisely insert nearly 40 kilograms of metal. And so on, again and again, in a compartment stuffy and heated by the engine and gun blasts, amidst the roar and shaking. The 35-round ammunition stowage was scattered all over the tank, some in the turret for quick access, some in awkward hull racks. When the nearest shells ran out, the loader had to literally crawl and pull them from hard-to-reach nooks, turning his work into an exhausting acrobatics. But the genuine curse of the crew was the mechanism meant to make life easier, the automatic spent casing ejector. The story of its creation bordered on the absurd. Development was ordered from the company Mulliners, known for producing cigarette vending machines. Apparently, the Ministry of Defense thought the principles of dispensing a pack of Lucky Strikes and ejecting a red-hot casing were the same. Reality brutally mocked this idea. The device, located behind the breech, was an unreliable nightmare. After a shot, the casing was supposed to fall onto a tray, hit a micro switch, and be ejected through a special hatch in the turret side. In practice, it constantly jammed, fell off the guides, or even locked the gun by dropping between the breech and the roof. The ejection hatch often remained open, becoming a perfect target for an enemy infantryman with a grenade. Crews soon realized they could only rely on the emergency manual crank, whose operation took a full 5 minutes, an eternity in combat conditions. At the other end of the tank, in the front right part of the hull, was the driver's station.
Controlling the 64-ton giant was no easy task. The steering levers, the pedals, the quirky gearbox with its mirrored patterns all demanded constant concentration. However, many drivers, overcoming the initial difficulties, found a peculiar satisfaction in it. The powerful, though underpowered, Meteor engine, with its characteristic aviation roar, gave a sense of commanding a true Leviathan. If you were driving a Conqueror, everyone got out of your way, tankers recalled. Visibility through the periscopes was limited, and the clatter of the metal tracks deafening, but the purely mechanical interaction with this behemoth worked. However, keeping this interaction operational was a task that fell on the shoulders of other people, the repair crews, for whom every Conqueror deployment to exercises turned into a multi-hour battle with its chronic ailments.
Upon entering service, Conquerors were distributed to units of the British Army of the Rhine in West Germany, on the sharpest edge of confrontation with the Warsaw Pact. Their tactical role was clearly defined and rather passive. These heavy giants were not to participate in swift breakthroughs or maneuver battles. Their place was in pre-prepared positions in the second echelon or on the flanks. Acting as ultra-long-range snipers, they were to cover the main forces of Centurions, picking off and destroying Soviet heavy tanks, primarily those same IS-3s, from ranges where they were ineffective. On paper, this concept looked flawless. However, the reality of operation quickly turned this ideal picture into an utter nightmare. The Conqueror proved to be a machine with catastrophically low reliability. The underpowered Meteor engine constantly overheated and failed, refusing to start in the cold or after a march. The finicky electrics of the commander's cupula, on which the tank's main advantage depended, failed with depressing frequency. The casing ejector mechanism, as expected, only worked sporadically. Every deployment to exercises turned into a struggle for the crew, not with a mock enemy, but with their own equipment. Repair crews from recovery units worked non-stop. They became virtuosos at replacing Horstman's suspension bogies right in the field and performing pinpoint fixes on the eternally failing wiring. Spare parts were consumed to keep these 185 machines running in incredible quantities. Every operational Conqueror on the front line meant mountains of spent resources and man-hours. Meanwhile, the expected enemy, hordes of Soviet IS-3s, never appeared on the horizon. The Soviet command, to the West's surprise, made a different strategic choice. It turned out the IS-3, for all its outwardly terrifying might, also had many problems: a cramped fighting compartment, low rate of fire, and its own unreliability. The USSR, like Britain, came to the conclusion that the future lay not in specialized heavy monsters, but in universal main battle tanks, MBTs, combining mobility, protection, and firepower. While Conquerors tortured their engines on German training grounds, Centurions underwent deep modernization, receiving first 84mm and then the famous 105mm L7 gun, capable of fighting any Soviet armor. The need for an expensive, finicky, and sluggish Titan killer faded away on its own. Its era, having barely begun, was already coming to an end.
By the early 1960s, the Conqueror's fate was sealed. Its combat value no longer justified the monstrous costs of operation. The specialized heavy tank killer was unnecessary in a world where the very concept of the heavy tank was becoming obsolete. In 1966, just 11 years after entering service, all 185 machines were withdrawn from the British Army of the Rhine. Their short service became a vivid illustration of a dead-end branch in armored vehicle development.
However, the legacy of this steel giant did not fade into oblivion. It proved surprisingly resilient. The direct and much more successful heir to the Conqueror was the Chieftain main battle tank. It inherited two key elements from its predecessor: a powerful 120mm rifled gun, though of a completely new design, the L-11, and, more importantly, the developed philosophy of the hunter-killer fire control system. British engineers learned from bitter experience. The commander in the Chieftain got similar independent target acquisition capabilities, but without the fatal isolation and finicky electrics of the earlier version. Thus, the Conqueror became an expensive but necessary testing ground for technologies that defined the look of British tanks for decades to come. Today, Conquerors can only be found as silent monuments. Most scrapped machines were shot to pieces as targets on ranges, or slowly rust at the gates of military bases and in open-air museums. One veteran even served as an unusual home for a stray cat named Stanley, who lived for many years inside its empty hull. This image, a powerful but abandoned colossus, became the perfect symbol for the end of an entire era. An era when the war of armor and caliber gave way to the war of electronics, balanced characteristics, and versatility. The Conqueror never met the IS-3 in battle, but its story clearly shows that sometimes the most formidable answer is to the wrong war. It was born from fear of a steel ghost with a pike nose and died, yielding to more perfect and practical machines, the ideas for which it, ironically, had itself given birth to.